So final sub-theme, 4C, leisure and travel, part of the quality of life topic. So caveat for this one, I will say, of all the topics as well, and I know I say this for quite a few of them, the focus here can sometimes be a little bit messy. It feels like almost they just sort of, all the content they hadn't sort of fit into the other sub-themes, they decided to put in this. And so it's leisure and travel, and essentially the breakdown of the topics are, it's a third of it is about sport, a second third of it is about holidays and travel, and then the third part, which is also travel, becomes, but yeah, so the second part is holidays, and the third part is travel, which is basically cars, and then a bit of stuff about other kind of transport and planes and things like that. So it can be difficult finding a really clear theme or trend between them. So what I would say is, the focus of this topic, as far as I can tell, or as an individual overall focus specific to this, is leisure pursuits, or more specifically, the extent to which leisure pursuits change among the British public over this time period. And there are, of course, other topics from different sub-themes that I've already mentioned, in particular for 4B, that is relevant here, but a lot of the stuff is self-contained, so things about changing leisure pursuits, that seems to me to be the main overall focus. However, what also seems to be the case to me is that this topic really significantly overlaps with questions of living standards. So when we did that first, or in that first topic, if you've watched it now, 4A, quality of life, I talked about how there are a few aspects of the rest of this theme that link into this one. And so I think in particular with 4C, some of the stuff is also interchangeable or relevant to a question about living standards. In particular, I think, questions about the living standards of the working class, or levelling of class, differences in social gaps, again, relevant to that theme 3A topic of social class, levelling of social class. So you need to really be aware of how you can potentially use these points in a range of other questions if they could potentially be relevant. So yeah, there are a few kind of relevant topics that you can combine with. So what I'll mainly focus on is this question of how far leisure pursuits change, and I'll sometimes come into this issue of working class, leisure time, how far it's accessible, etc. Okay, so the first part of this topic is the spectator sports. It's almost like a sub-theme in a sub-theme, it's really weird, or subtopic in a sub-theme. So, as a brief outline before I go into in a bit more detail. In the interwar period, you get a range of spectator sports developing that have important social functions, so things like football, rugby, cricket. What you do get is you get an increase in leisure time, enabling working class supporters to attend these events, and links between local communities are created that helps that leads to a close affinity developing between supporters and their local teams. And you do in general get sports continuing to increase in popularity during the interwar period, and so as a form of leisure, I'm going to argue quite a bit that actually it does become more popular or increasingly important as a form of leisure act or a way of spending leisure time in the interwar period. So we can argue that spectator sports do have an effect, will do affect people's quality of life, or do have an effect in improving people's quality of life. And actually they do become quite central to many people's way of life. So if you look at the number of people attending sporting events in the interwar period, it's quite obvious immediately that actually it's a really successful, or it's quite successful in acting as a very cheap form of entertainment for mass spectator audiences. Again, if you've looked at the 4B lecture recently, in a very similar way in which cinema and dance halls had been as well. So even though stadiums tend to have quite poor facilities, and they're really kind of run down and not very nice places to go to, tickets for a lot of big spectator sports were very cheap, and so most people could afford to attend them. This is particularly the case because for most of this time period, so for all the interwar period and up until I think the beginning of the 70s, player wages, and I think most professional sports are actually capped. So any of you kind of into your sport, you'll often see these graphs of average player wages. Part of the reason behind that is because those wages were initially capped, and so players are getting paid huge amounts, which means that you can afford to keep ticket prices low, and as a result, most working class people could afford to attend different spectator sports. So the really prime example of popular sports, you obviously have, for example, football is kind of the obvious one. So you've got about 20 million people attending football matches each year. Then you've also got, in terms of big spectator events at the events themselves, horse racing at some of the major courses attracts some huge crowds. So between 200 to 500,000 people will sometimes attend a major horse racing event over the course of a weekend, wherever they are. But then, kind of a bit of a weird one, because it's kind of fallen out of fashion or is no longer so significant. Bog racing is also a really popular working class leisure activity. So you get these really famous dog rings or dog racing tracks that are built, one in White City, and I think it was recently knocked down, the old Walthamstow dog ring. These places can attract crowds up to 100,000 people, which is a staggering number to see a few skinny dogs running around a track. So spectator sports are quite a central way of people's life and become quite popular and prominent, in particular attending those events live in stadiums. The other reason, or the other way in which spectator sports continue to become more important and become more popular is through the increased prominence of, or the spread of, or the importance of radio broadcasts. So again, if you listen to the 4B topic recently, we mentioned how radio kind of comes into its own in the interval period, and what starts to happen is people begin to, BBC begins to broadcast a lot of spectator sports on the radio. There is initially this fear that actually this might lead to a decline in attendances, because people for the first time can actually follow sports events across the country. So it's actually, again, it's quite interesting to kind of to know. Before the rise of radio, to kind of follow any sort of sport, you had to actually attend it live. With the sort of rise of radio, you could basically just sit at home for the first time and listen to it. However, instead of actually leading to a decline in attendance, it actually instead leads to attendance slightly increasing, because it helps a lot of these sports develop sort of national spectator audiences, in particular football. Football, due to radio broadcasts, really is able to develop a national audience for the first time, as opposed to people simply following their local teams. And so it's able to transform into a national spectator sport and become more popular as a result as well. And then the final way which you can argue that it leads to an increase in quality of life in the interval period is again linked to this point about areas, linked to the point we mentioned in the 4B lecture, when it comes to looking at areas that are depressed due to the economic downturn. What tends to take place actually, so rather than improving quality of life, what you actually get is leisure time, or sort of leisure activities changing somewhat, as sporting attendance actually tends to drop in some of the poorer areas. So football, rugby and cricket in the poorest areas struggle quite a lot. People are no longer able to afford tickets in these areas, and that has a knock-on effect on the clubs themselves, in particular rugby league. So rugby league as a sport, outside of places like Lancashire and Yorkshire, most clubs in the country basically close due to poor attendance, and that's kind of got an impact even today. If you look at rugby league, the big historic clubs are the ones in sort of Yorkshire and Lancashire. These are the only places where those clubs actually survive. There is, though, in this area a bit of a class divide, and so again, this could potentially be a topic which, or an issue you could bring up on a question about class. As opposed to these working class sports, middle class sports tend to thrive again in the interwar period and during the Depression as well, and continue to enjoy large audiences. So when we talk middle class sports, we're talking about things like tennis, show jumping, golf. So I think in 1933, about 50,000 people paying go to attend the Ryder Cup. So there is a bit of a divide when it comes to leisure time and sports, when it comes to class. Additionally as well, as a more minor point, these audiences are as well typically male, and so sport has very little impact on the quality of life for women. So again, that could possibly, if you had a question about quality of life, you could sort of add on that point as a follow-up when it comes to discussing this issue of women, because women do have a very different quality of life to men in interwar periods for a range of different reasons. After the Second World War, leisure pursuits do begin to change as well, continue to change, especially when it comes to sport. So again, interestingly, given kind of the current state of sport, traditionally, the most popular sport in the country is actually county cricket, and that's still the case by the end of the 1950s. It's only really by the 60s that this kind of goes into decline and other sports begin to overtake it in popularity. I'll go into some of those in a moment. Part of the reason behind that is arguably due to cricket's association. So cricket as a sport has two issues. First of all, heavily associated with Britain's imperial past, as it's the sport that Britain takes to the empire and really promotes. So it has that negative connotation to go with it. Additionally, it's also seen to be the sport of the middle and upper class, and rather it's associated with middle and upper class culture. So these are both ideas that are becoming increasingly outdated or being rejected in the 60s with the kind of empire, with the kind of deference, and so cricket with it kind of takes a hit as the nation's game and begins to decline. And so there is an argument that you can kind of make that as a point of how leisure pursuits do change after the war as cricket sort of takes a back seat. Takes a back seat to other sports that are becoming increasingly popular. You do also, though, more broadly, get the development of a kind of, the way it's phrased, a more sporting culture. I do find this a slightly more tricky point to sustain overall, but there is an argument that actually you get kind of this broader sporting culture developing, and that's largely driven by the massive ownership or rise of ownership of television, which increases people's access more frequently to global sporting events. So things like the World Cup, the Olympics, the Commonwealth Games are for the first time now being broadcast to people in their living rooms and are starting to attract very large audiences, and people are beginning to kind of consider global sports in a way they weren't beforehand. Again, the most famous example is you have 32 million people tuning in to watch England defeat West Germany in 1966, which is, I'm pretty sure, more than half the country at the time, and then way more, a lot more than half. You did then also get, as a follow-up to that, the government increasingly investing in sporting facilities during the 60s and 70s to help Britain compete, or British athletes compete internationally, given this increased interest among the population in international sporting events. And that's kind of, kind of the way in which that sort of changes. And then sort of in 1972 develop or establish the Sports Council of Great Britain. That's job is essentially to promote sport amongst the country and among various different groups in society. Kind of helps to fund different sporting activities and develop various different elite programs to train athletes, as well as sort of opening clubs and things like that across the country for more local involvement in sport. But as I say, I do find this a slightly more tricky point to sustain or discuss. The final way in which leisure pursuits change after the war, again just thinking about sport, is the relative decline in football attendance. So while football remains a popular national spectator sport, it does see a decline in actual live attendances. Even though they remain quite high during the period, the numbers do drop significantly. So by the 70s, the number of people attending games on a weekly basis, I think it's on a yearly basis, falls by 10 million from its 1948 level. Now, with this point, it is arguable that actually the reason why it's so high in 48 is because those are during the austerity years, and so people during austerity, you can't spend much money on things like food, clothes, so a lot of people's disposable income, well, if they had any to begin with, often ended up going on things like football because there wasn't anything else you could spend on. And then actually, with growing living standards elsewhere and increased access to other consumer items, people increasingly spent their money and dealt in other pastimes as opposed to attending weekly football. Additionally, as I said, there's this change in how football is basically consumed as a product. So with the rise of television, people no longer actually have to attend the games and can watch from their homes. And the final point is that you increasingly begin to get this issue with hooliganism developing. And hooliganism is a particular problem in the 60s and the 70s. And that kind of has this sort of snowball effect where hooliganism drives a lot of fans away from the stadiums, and then kind of means there are more hooligans in them to begin with, which kind of makes it worse. And then they also have fewer kind of older men in the stadiums who kind of previously controlled these sort of younger, more pragmatic fans. So that again kind of leads to a change in the way in which certain sports are consumed by the public, and as a result of people's changing leisure interests. So those are kind of all the points in relation to sport. What I would say is you're never really, unless you're unlucky, going to get a question entirely about sport or changing sporting interests. You're more likely to get it as part of a broader question about leisure activities. And so if anyone's kind of worried about that, like I can generally assure you, you're not going to have to write an entire essay about like football and horse racing. Okay, the second big part of this topic then is this issue, or rather is this tourism topic. This I think is the biggest sort of part of this sub-theme, and actually I think the most interesting, and I think has the most potential for various points you can discuss. So there's this debate about, again, how far tourism changes people's leisure activities or leisure time, and I think it also links in really nicely to that quality of life topic with this question of how far holidays and tourism is accessible to the public, and also links into the class topic, the extent to which class is being levelled, how far there's a class gap in terms of people's enjoyment of holidays. So, looking at tourism. In the early 1920s, I think it's very difficult to argue that it's something available to anybody but the very wealthy. There are very few working class people able to take holidays before 1918. And as a result, the tourism infrastructure that is available in the country in the 20s is one that was set up mainly to cater for the very wealthy. So when we talk about tourism infrastructure, you're basically talking about expensive seaside hotels and resorts and leisure facilities like golf courses. You also get sailing being quite popular, both off coast and more inland. So these are all these various types of activities that are really only accessible to the wealthiest. You also get foreign holidays, but again, that's also exclusively the reserve of the wealthy. So you get people kind of holidaying in the French Riviera. Greek and Italian tours tend to be quite popular as well. What you do, so at the beginning of the 20s, you get a tourism or a holiday infrastructure or industry that is mainly targeted or mainly caters for the wealthy. What you do get though is that increasingly throughout the interwar period it begins to cater for other demographics due to some changes that take place. So what you get in the interwar period is the rise of holiday pay and free time, or actually increased leisure time. So as I mentioned, part of the reason why the holiday industry was basically so inaccessible for most people was because it was designed for people who were the only groups that were actually able to go on holiday in the first place. So the actual basic idea of leisure time itself was before 1918 very much the preserve of the elite, but it's something which gradually becomes extended to the masses in the early 20th century. And that is when you get workers workers are gradually allowed to take holidays, though usually unpaid. Workers are allowed to take holidays, but they're usually unpaid. In 1925, you see labour reforms that allow 1.5 million workers to get holiday pay. And then in 1938, the Holiday Pay Act extends that right to nearly 8 million workers. And so you have the first time millions of working class people who are able to take a certain number of days off during the year and actually get paid for those days off, and so they're able to for the first time. The recommendation was initially for there to be 3 consecutive days of holiday, and so as a result, the number of people who take a week holiday or more remains at around 1/3 of the country. So most holidays do tend to end up just being a couple of days at the seaside, as opposed to sort of long, week-long excursions. Having said that, that's still an improvement on what was available to previous generations, and so this rise of holiday pay, the Holiday Pay Act, is a big driver in the development of a tourist industry for working class people. What you also get as a factor that contributes to this is the growth in affordability of cars or various different types of transport that wasn't reliant on train travel. So traditionally, sort of the forms of travel that were available to people were basically trains, but trains obviously as a mode of travel are quite restrictive in terms of the places they can take you to, and so those networks tended to be focused around things like seaside resorts. With the growth and availability of cars, you've got an increasingly large number of locations that are available for people to access. So whether it's owning your individual car or basically being able to buy a bus ticket or go on a coach somewhere, people can now increasingly travel to more rural parts of the country which were previously inaccessible. So places like parts of Scotland, the Lake District, North Wales, increasingly become open to access by large numbers of tourists. So you've got, for example, in terms of interesting numbers, about 70,000 people per year visiting the Lake District in the 1930s. Similarly, with that rise in people able to attend these places or go to these places on holidays, you also get the development of an infrastructure designed to actually cater for those groups. So once you start to get people increasingly going to these locations, you get the development of hostels by the YHA in rural areas that helps to drive down the cost of hiking holidays. So again, it kind of snowballs as an effect as you get this development, or this industry developing that becomes increasingly accessible. In this instance, driven by new forms of transport. Okay. You then also get various infrastructural, various things developing that allow people to, or that allow for the increased popularity and that allow for the increased popularity and accessibility of seaside tourism, which again becomes increasingly affordable for working class people. And that's for a couple of reasons. So one of the factors that leads to this is after the First World War, you get an increase in what they refer to as seaside boarding houses, which are basically cheaper alternatives to hotels. And what essentially happens is, because the First World War leaves so many widows who basically got a house on their own but don't necessarily need the whole time, you get a lot of these women, either war widows or women who are just simply unmarried, running these boarding houses that are fairly cheap to run. And so in Blackpool alone, for example, you have about 4,000 of these in the 1920s. These boarding houses aren't brilliant. They tend to be quite strict in terms of the behaviour that the landlady might expect, but they were quite accessible for most people in terms of their wages as a result. Though it wasn't particularly popular once they put disposable income, given that they generally would have preferred a slightly slightly better place to stay in. The really big change, though, that takes place, and one of the strongest arguments to argue, or one of the strongest reasons why leisure activities change, is the rise of the Butlins holiday camps, which make seaside tourism significantly more affordable for working class people. And the whole experience is transformed by the creation of these holiday camps by Bill Butlin, or Billy Butlin. And so in 1936, he creates the first of the Butlin camp, or Butlin's camp empire in Skegness. And the thing he promises people a week's holiday for a week's wage. And so it's really designed to be a budget holiday camp that's meant to be a really nice experience for working class men and their families. And so it's all about kind of promoting these very cheap holidays, but at the same time it's meant to be of a high standard and a high quality, sort of emulate chalet accommodation. They have a range of activities available, entertainments. I mean, the whole thing ends up being quite tacky, but people at the time were quite pleased by the idea. And so the idea itself is initially quite successful. The Butlin's camp empire grows massively. By 1939, the two camps he's so far got provide for 100,000 visitors each year. And so the Butlin's holiday camp are definitely an example of sort of new forms of leisure activities being made available to working class people. Okay. You then get leisure activities or travel or tourism, particularly transforming after the Second World War. In particular, you get the growth of foreign tourism in this period. So loads of businesses start to, for the first time, offer fortnight or offer at least a fortnight annual leave to workers. So again, the annual leave that workers are given paid is increasing after the Second World War, and that then also results in, once again, a greater industry developing around foreign travel. And their increased affordability. So you start to get to cater for this large audience of people, a growth in cheap airlines that can fly, and accommodation, which will come back to when we look at air travel. And these prove to be quite highly popular. Beachfronts in Spain are basically transformed entirely in many ways due to the growing tourist industry that's cropping up to accommodate for British tourists going abroad there. And so in terms of the numbers of people going, you get kind of interesting stats. So, for example, from 68 to 72, the percentage of British holidays going, or British holidays to the Mediterranean, doubled in that time period. And the numbers of people going on holidays abroad trebles in the 70s alone by the end of the decade. So you start to get a growth in foreign tourism. And then you also start to get new forms of tourism, though I'm not sure how significant this is in the first place, due to the rise of caravanning and also ideas like the hippie trail. So you start to get people increasingly purchasing caravans in the post-war period. So caravan holidays account for about 20% of all holidays in the 1960s. And about half the country had been on a caravan holiday by the 1970s, which in particular helped to fuel this kind of domestic tourism as well. You also then, this is why I think it's a bit less significant, but it's a point you can make nonetheless in terms of changing travel interest. You also start to get the growth of kind of alternative ideas for travel, fueled by kind of the demand for more authentic travel experiences, in particular among young people in the 70s, which helps develop something known as the hippie trail, which is essentially this route people travel to Nepal and India, usually kind of by a car, essentially through Europe. To be honest, it's basically people searching for cheap availability of like drugs like hashish and opium. As I say, the numbers of people who actually go on holidays are quite small, and so it's difficult to look. There's obviously, it's not really a point about some really wide-scale changes in holiday interests, but it definitely demonstrates that there are a wide range of attitudes now towards leisure and travel, and there's also a much wider range of leisure activities available in this post-war period. So then, the third and final part of the sub-theme is then the impact of car ownership and travel development, so which I've already hinted about a little bit. So it's kind of got it's got this separate final topic, which is about transport. The main part of that is basically car ownership, and so the development of the car industry has definitely had a significant impact, or caused quite a great transformation in Britain. And that can be seen in a few different ways. So one of the ways which has had a significant impact of transformation is the effect it's had on the country's transport infrastructure. So the growth of cars has led to significant changes to kind of urban environments across the country, and this construction now of a massive motorway network across the nation. Various different towns and cities have been redesigned to accommodate for this change that has taken place. And of course, you've also had the development of foreign holidays again, that then saw a development or a boom in air travel. Okay, so I'm mainly going to focus on the impact of car ownership and then briefly come back to a couple of points about rail travel and then air travel as well. So, the impact of car ownership has basically been quite significant. Firstly, that impact can be seen on the actual urban environments. So one thing that changes quite rapidly is the Victorian nature of many inner cities in the interwar period due to the rise of cars. So if you go back to London, for example, or most cities just in 1923, you'll get, for example, you'll still see a large number of horse-drawn carriages, which is a really bizarre thought to consider. So in 1923, you've got about 200,000 horse-drawn carriages still going around towns and cities in the country, and that drops to 12,000 by 1937. You also then begin to see the disappearance, the gradual disappearance of actually what was quite a large network of trams across the country. Councils instead begin to focus more on investing in their bus services, and trams begin to slowly disappear from across the country. So essentially, if you go back 100 years, you'll find that actually trams and horse-drawn carriages are quite popular. These disappearances can be largely attributed to cars. So by 1934, you get about 2.5 million cars on the road, about half of which are privately owned. So that has a significant impact on urban environments across the country, and previous methods of transport that already exist. The second impact that cars have, and this is where again it can be relevant to a different topic, a particular social class, is cars, as you can imagine, become another way in which the class divide manifests itself in the country. Cars do not start off as an affordable item, and so in the 20s they're actually extremely expensive. So in terms of numbers, we're talking about things like £250 for a Rover in 1929. That is far more than anybody, well that's far more than anything that most people in the country could afford. You do start to get prices falling in the early 30s with the rise of small family cars, generally available for around £100. However, that's still really something which only middle class families can afford. And so again, just to put it into perspective, when we say £100, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but if you've watched the housing or the welfare video recently with one about housing, some kind of older houses will basically cost you, again, roughly about £100. So some of these cars basically cost the same as an old house. So they're basically highly affordable for most people. Working class people, if they ever could access cars, they would almost always be second hand. And normally, they wouldn't normally purchase a car for their own family. You basically get a working class neighbourhood kind of pooling resources together to purchase a car kind of for the community to share ownership of instead. So car ownership in the interwar period is definitely an area in which the class divide manifests itself once again. You then also, again, in terms of the impact on the country, start to get the expansion of the road network beginning. You can't really compare it in terms of its scale to what happens in the post-war period, but you do start to see the beginning of some large-scale projects and expansion of road networks in the 30s. So you get, for example, new tarmac roads being built on pre-existing highways throughout the country, a lot of these older highways, in addition to newer roads being built in the countryside. Then you also get a couple of high-profile and significant building projects that are carried out in the 30s, one of which is the Mersey Tunnel in 1934. And then you also get the launching of the major part of the Great North Road in 1939, which I think is nowadays the A1, which essentially will take you from London all the way to the north of the country. You don't really get many major roads outside of these though, so you basically get a couple of really high-profile projects, but it's nothing in comparison to the large-scale building which takes place after the Second World War. Another point which I think you could mention, but I suppose would probably be quite tricky to factor into any relevant essays, so you could perhaps swerve this one, unless you can think of anything else. Another impact that has, which is quite negative, is the impact it has, or problematic consequence, is on road deaths. So road safety when cars are first introduced is particularly poor. So in the late 1920s, you've got about 100,000 crashes. And when you actually consider the relatively small number of cars on the road, that's a staggering number. So you get about close to 5,000 deaths in the late 1920s, and that increases as car ownership also increases with it. So in 1934 alone, you have 8,000 deaths and 230,000 injuries. You do get, as a follow-up consequence, the introduction, therefore, of the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit in large parts of the country, and for the first time, the introduction of the road traffic test, of driver's tests, the Road Traffic Act in 1934. Despite that, though, most parts of the country still have no speed limit at all until 1965. As I said, this is a point which would be difficult to fit into most essays, or would be a bit strange to mention in an essay about impact of car ownership. But I suppose it's something you can potentially mention if you can think of anything else. And then the final point, which I've already kind of mentioned briefly for this interwar period, is the point you mentioned about the impact it has on leisure activities. So the increased ownership of cars, in particular for private individuals, opens up new opportunities or places for people to travel for leisure activities or sort of tourism. So you start to get increasingly things like travel guides for drivers and maps becoming quite popular, and various tips about where you can go. They start to become quite useful for things like day trips or weekend trips. And additionally, what's worth mentioning here is, even though we mentioned something about class divide, that class divide is available in terms of actually purchasing cars. But you don't simply have private cars available. With the rise of cars, you also get things like buses and coaches becoming more common. And so car ownership doesn't simply open up opportunities that are exclusive to middle class people. Working class people can now again increasingly enjoy buses, to enjoy day trips to places like the seaside, to more rural areas, etc. So it does have some accessibility to various parts of the population. The real impact of car ownership, though, comes with, once again, the post-war consumer boom. So like many other consumer items, which again we mentioned in the 4A topic, you start to see the mass ownership of cars beginning after the Second World War. Not because of the British car industry itself. The British car industry tends to be quite poor, arguably because they're state-owned. A lot of the cars manufactured have quite serious issues over quality and reliability. However, and they're not particularly cheap either. However, British consumers are increasingly able to buy imports like the Beetle, the Golf, as well as kind of cheap Japanese cars like Datsun Sunny. And these tend to be quite cheap, reliable, and high-quality vehicles, and so ownership increases quite significantly. And so by 1972, you get about 13 million drivers across Britain as a result. Despite that, though, and the increased accessibility of cars to different classes, it does continue to be a symbol of the class divide. So again, middle-class families tend to be able to own 2 cars. Men can, as a result, therefore commute to work. And what that means is, as a result, you start to see the construction of a range of suburbs and villages outside of the main urban centres, so places like sort of Tellingwood and Hertfordshire. And these suburbs start to become almost exclusively middle-class areas. And so because this ability to kind of purchase multiple cars and commute to work, it's a feasible option for a middle-class family to move out into these nice brand new suburbs as they can still commute to work in a way that the working-class family cannot. So in terms of car ownership, you'll, for example, have working-class families in the northeast being the least likely to have cars. And so that has a knock-on impact on things like travel. A lot of children in those areas, for example, very rarely have the opportunity to travel. So again, despite the closing of the gap, it continues to be a symbol of the class divide despite that, and another way in which it manifests itself. Another area then, how it links into the 4A topic when we discuss supermarkets, is the impact that car ownership has on consumer habits, as I said in particular, with the rise of supermarkets. So you begin to see a greater quantity of groceries basically being loaded up in big weekly shops. As people now own basically big fridges at home and big cars, you can, for the first time, as a kind of new phenomena, go to one big weekly shop to attend a big supermarket, sort of sort yourself out for the week, and kind of go home with that. And then so you start to get supermarkets beginning to cater for this change in sort of people's travel habits. So you start to get the creation of these massive multi-storey car parks outside of towns. So again, one of the early versions of this was in Asda, that was Nottinghamshire, that had about 1,000 car capacity car park. And then you start to get hundreds of these different types of supermarkets being spawned across the country, which also has a knock-on effect, as I say, in a sort of snowballing fashion on people's consumer habits more broadly. Final impact it has, well, the second to last impact it has with regards to car ownership is on transport more broadly. It continues to have a big impact or significant impact on transport. An obvious example is the fact that with more private ownership of cars, buses and coaches begin to become less popular in terms of their, start to become less popular. But the really big knock-on effect that car ownership has, and it's important not to underestimate its impact, is the quite big impact it has on the railways. So again, I think for us it's quite hard to imagine that in the 19th century, Britain had a significantly larger railway network than we have today. With the sort of industrial revolution, a massive railway infrastructure was kind of built up across the country. However, with cars becoming increasingly quite popular, that has an effect on the railways. And it's not actually so much because of the travel figures themselves. Travel figures remain quite steady. However, the operation of those railways becomes increasingly expensive. And so a government decision is taken. It's called the Beeching Axe, because it's named after, I think, the minister who basically makes the decision. I think it's the Transport Minister, or the Transport Commission. He basically makes the decision that from now on the government will instead start to invest money into prioritising the road network and building a lot of these bigger motorways, And what they then do is they actually remove and put out of operation half of Britain's railway infrastructure. And that's why if you kind of ever travel to various parts of the north, all these kind of different like off-road tracks, you'll often kind of go to locations with these sort of old derelict railways that are no longer in use. So a large part of Britain's really extensive railway network, what the decision was taken to kind of put it out of use and out of service in the post-war period due to the increased importance of cars. So rail travel particularly not as a result. And kind of as a follow-up point to that, the final kind of most significant impact it does have, therefore, is this really large-scale building project when it comes to road development in the 60s and 70s. The most significant period of road development in this country is the 60s and 70s. So in 1959, we get the opening of the M1, which is the first proper full-length motorway in the country, linking London to Birmingham. And you start to get, in the following years, more motorways full-length being gradually built up. That has a couple of different impacts. So environmentalists are particularly upset by this, often complaining about the loss of green space that accompanies the development of motorways and sort of various aspects of noise pollution. However, again, in terms of the knock-on effects it has, it does increasingly make it easier for many people to travel across Britain than it ever has been before. Which has a particular which has a significant impact on people's quality of life as a result. Final point then, just as a kind of minor point to finish off this topic, there's this brief bit at the end about air travel. So again, we can link into points about sort of changing travel or leisure pursuits or reasons why it changes. Air travel begins to develop across the century in a significant way. So initially, it's quite small scale. So in the interwar period, kind of main airways is this Imperial Airways that flies kind of international routes. They only really have about 200,000 or 250,000 passengers in 1937. How obviously, as I already mentioned, in the post-war period, leisure activities or transport does transform when you start to get these cheap holidays, leading to a growing demand for plane travel. And so the number of people travelling by plane rises to about 14 million in the post-war period. And a major factor was, as I mentioned when I discussed the foreign holidays, is the rise of these budget airlines and charter flights. So you start to get these different routes being pioneered by, for example, Labour Airlines in '66, who basically charter flights by essentially booking things in advance as part of these greater packages. So that's the final impact that has on transport. So, as I said, as a topic, it can be quite disconnected in terms of the various different points that you mentioned. But I think in general, there tend to be sort of 2 to 3 main topics. The big one really is changing leisure interests. And with that topic, you can basically discuss either sport, holidays and travel, then you can also sort of bring in extra topics from various different topics. And that wraps up the themes.